7-year-old black girl was selling her only doll for groceries. What 40 Hells Angels did changed all. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The late afternoon sun hung low above a quiet grocery store parking lot in a small desert town in Arizona. The asphalt still held the heat from a long dry day, and the warm air carried the smell of gasoline and dust drifting across the wide open road. Most people walking in and out of the store were thinking about dinner or the long drive home after work. Almost no one noticed the small figure standing near the edge of the sidewalk, close to the shopping carts. She could not have been older than 7 years old. Her name was Naomi Carter. Her braided hair was a little messy from the wind, and her sneakers were worn down at the toes from months of use. In her arms, she held a single object with careful hands, as if it were something fragile and precious. It was a small cloth doll. The doll was clearly old. The fabric had faded from bright pink to a pale dusty color, and one of the stitched eyes had been repaired with a thread that did not match the original cloth. Naomi held it tightly against her chest for a moment before slowly lowering it toward a small piece of cardboard that rested on the ground beside her feet. Written across that cardboard in uneven pencil letters were simple words that looked like they had been written by a child trying very hard to be understood. Selling my doll for groceries. The letters were shaky but clear. Naomi shifted her weight from one foot to the other as cars rolled through the parking lot. Every time someone walked past, she looked up with a quiet, hopeful expression, though she never called out and never chased anyone for attention. She simply stood there holding the doll and the cardboard sign as if she believed that someone would eventually stop and understand. A woman pushing a shopping cart slowed down for a moment and looked at the sign, but then continued walking without speaking. A man carrying grocery bags glanced over his shoulder, but quickly turned away. Naomi did not cry, and she did not complain. She only looked down at the doll in her hands and gently brushed dust from its fabric dress with the side of her thumb. For a brief moment, she hugged it again, as if remembering something warm and comforting. Then she placed it back above the cardboard sign and waited. What Naomi did not know was that the quiet rumble of several motorcycles was beginning to echo across the far end of the parking lot. The sound was deep and steady like distant thunder rolling across the desert highway. One by one the motorcycles turned off the road and entered the lot, their engines vibrating through the hot evening air. People looked up as the riders slowly pulled into a line near the edge of the store. The leather vests and powerful machines were impossible to ignore. They belonged to members of the Hells Angels riding club. And in just a few moments, one of those riders was going to notice the small girl standing alone beside a cardboard sign and a single worn doll. And that simple moment was about to change everything. The deep rumble of motorcycle engines rolled slowly across the grocery store parking lot as the line of bikes came to a steady stop near the far edge of the building. Heat shimmered above the asphalt while the chrome of the motorcycles reflected the orange glow of the late afternoon sun. People walking toward the store entrance slowed down and turned their heads. In a small town like this, it was not every day that a large group of bikers arrived all at once. There were 40 of them in total, riding heavy American machines built for long miles on open highways. Leather vests shifted as the riders stepped off their bikes and removed their helmets. The air smelled faintly of engine oil and warm rubber as the engines went silent one by one. At the center of the group stood a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s named Jack Callahan. The years had carved deep lines into his face, and a short gray beard framed a jaw that looked like it had seen more than its share of hard days. His vest carried the familiar patch of the Hells Angels riding club. Jack had ridden thousands of miles across the country over the course of his life, but he never stopped paying attention to what was happening around him. While several of the other riders stretched their backs or joked quietly after the long ride, Jack's eyes moved slowly across the parking lot, as if he were reading the scene like a page in a book. That was when he noticed the small figure standing alone near the row of shopping carts. At first it was simply the contrast that caught his attention. A tiny child standing by herself in the middle of a busy parking lot while adults walked past without stopping. Then he saw the cardboard sign at her feet. Jack narrowed his eyes slightly, and took a few steps closer, his boots making a steady sound against the pavement. From where he stood, he could now read the uneven pencil letters written across the cardboard, knee so that he would not tower over her. The shadow of his tall frame stretched across the pavement beside the cardboard sign. Naomi looked up and saw the large man in the leather vest kneeling in front of her. Her fingers tightened slightly around the doll. Jack spoke in a calm voice that carried the rough warmth of someone who had spent many years talking over the sound of engines and highway wind. "Hello there, young lady. My name is Jack. What is your name?" The girl hesitated for a moment before answering in a small but steady voice. "Naomi." Jack gave a slow nod. "That is a nice name." Naomi glanced down at the cardboard sign and then back at the doll in her hands. For a moment, it looked like she might change her mind and walk away. But then she held the doll out again, just as she had done for every other stranger that day. "I am selling her so I can buy groceries for my mom." Behind Jack, the rest of the bikers had begun to gather quietly, forming a loose half circle several yards away. None of them laughed, and none of them spoke loudly. They simply watched the small girl standing there with the worn doll and the cardboard sign. Jack felt something tighten deep in his chest as he looked at the careful way Naomi held the toy. It was the kind of grip a child used when holding the one thing in the world that still made them feel safe. And in that moment, Jack Callahan knew that whatever had brought this little girl to a grocery store parking lot with a cardboard sign was not going to be ignored. Naomi held the cloth doll out carefully with both hands, as if it were something fragile that might fall apart if she squeezed it too tightly. The warm wind brushed strands of her braided hair across her cheek, while she waited for the tall biker kneeling in front of her to say something. Jack Callahan looked down at the doll for a long moment. The small toy had clearly been loved for many years. Its fabric dress was faded and one arm had been stitched back together with thread that did not quite match the rest of the cloth. It was not the kind of thing a child would normally give up unless there was no other choice left. Jack spoke slowly and gently so the girl would not feel frightened. "Naomi, this doll must be very special to you." Naomi nodded once without hesitation. Her voice was soft but certain. "She has been mine since I was very little. My mom gave her to me when I was a baby." Jack felt the weight of that sentence settle in the air between them. He glanced briefly toward the cardboard sign on the ground, and then back to the child in front of him. "If that is true, then why are you trying to sell her?" Naomi looked down again at the doll in her hands. Her fingers smoothed the worn fabric of its dress, as though she was apologizing to it for what she was about to do. "Because we need food." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet honesty that made several of the bikers standing behind Jack shift their weight uneasily. Rico Morales folded his arms across his chest and stared down at the pavement for a moment. Another rider named Ben Carter let out a slow breath through his nose. Jack remained still where he was kneeling. "How long have you been standing here, Naomi?" The girl thought for a moment before answering. "Since after school." The sun was still high then, but now it was drifting lower behind the grocery store building and stretching long shadows across the parking lot. Jack understood what that meant. Naomi had been standing out here alone for hours hoping someone would notice her sign. "Did anyone buy the doll yet?" Naomi shook her head. One man asked how much, but he said he did not need a doll. Jack nodded slowly. That answer did not surprise him. Most people walking past a child selling a toy in a parking lot probably assumed it was some kind of game or a child trying to earn pocket money. Very few people would stop long enough to ask the question that actually mattered. Jack rested one hand against his knee and leaned forward slightly. "Naomi, how much are you trying to sell the doll for?" The girl held up a small hand and spread 3 fingers. $3. I think that is enough for bread and maybe eggs." The quiet sincerity in her voice made the group of bikers behind Jack fall completely silent. $3. A child was willing to give up the one toy she had loved since she was a baby for $3 worth of groceries. Jack reached into the pocket of his jeans and slowly pulled out a folded bill. He opened it carefully and held it out toward Naomi. The paper moved slightly in the warm breeze. Naomi looked at the money but did not take it right away. Instead, she studied Jack's face as if she was trying to understand something important. Jack spoke in the same calm voice he had used before. "This is $20. I will buy the doll from you." Naomi's eyes widened for a moment. Then something surprising happened. She shook her head gently and pushed the money back toward him. "I cannot take that much." Jack blinked once. "Why not?" Naomi pointed at the cardboard sign near her feet. "I only need $3. That is what groceries cost for tonight." Behind Jack, one of the bikers muttered softly under his breath in disbelief. Naomi lowered her eyes again and hugged the doll against her chest for a brief moment before holding it out once more. If you want to buy her, you can give me $3, and I will give you the rest back. Jack looked at the small girl standing there with absolute seriousness in her eyes and realized something that struck him harder than anything else she had said so far. This child was not begging. She was trying to make an honest trade because that was the only way she knew how to help her mother. Jack Callahan remained kneeling in front of Naomi while the warm desert wind moved quietly across the parking lot. The $20 bill was still in his hand, but he slowly lowered it when he realized the girl truly meant what she said. Naomi Carter was not asking for charity. She was trying to make an honest exchange because in her young mind that was the right thing to do. Jack studied her face for a moment. Children that young usually spoke without thinking, but Naomi had a calm seriousness that felt far older than 7 years. Jack gently folded the bill again and placed it back into his pocket. Then he reached into the same pocket once more and pulled out several smaller bills. He separated 3 single-dollar bills and held them out in his open palm. Naomi looked at the money and then at the doll in her hands. For a moment her small fingers tightened around the cloth toy as if part of her wanted to pull it back and run home with it. The doll had been with her through every night she could remember. It had been there when she was scared during thunderstorms and when her mother tucked her into bed after long days at school. But Naomi had already made her decision before she walked to the grocery store. She slowly placed the doll into Jack's waiting hand and accepted the $3 bills. Her voice was quiet but polite. "Thank you, sir." Jack held the doll carefully, almost awkwardly, as if he was aware that he had just taken something that meant far more to the child than the money he had given her. Naomi immediately bent down and picked up the cardboard sign from the ground. She folded it once and tucked it under her arm. Then she looked up at Jack again. "I have to buy groceries now before the store closes." Jack nodded slowly. "Of course you do." Naomi turned toward the store entrance, but Jack spoke again before she could take more than a few steps. "Naomi, wait a moment." The girl turned back. "Yes, sir." Jack stood up and glanced over his shoulder at the group of bikers watching from several yards away. They had remained silent during the entire conversation, but their faces showed that every one of them had heard what Naomi said about selling the doll for food. Jack turned back toward the girl. "Naomi, where is your mother right now?" "She is at home resting. She has been very tired lately." Jack crouched slightly so he could meet her eyes again. "Has she eaten today?" Naomi hesitated before answering. "I gave her the last soup we had this morning. She said she was not hungry, but I know she was just trying to save it for me." The words landed heavily in the quiet space between them. Jack felt the same tight pressure in his chest that he used to feel when he heard stories about families struggling to get through another week. Behind him, Rico Morales rubbed the back of his neck and shook his head slowly. Jack looked back toward the grocery store entrance where people were still walking in and out carrying bags of food without realizing what was happening just a few yards away. Then he returned his attention to Naomi. "What were you planning to buy with the $3? "Bread and eggs if they have them. Maybe peanut butter if it is not too much." Jack nodded once. "That sounds like a good plan." Naomi gave a small, determined nod of her own and began walking toward the sliding glass doors of the store. The $3 bills were held carefully in her hand, as if they were the most valuable thing she owned. Jack watched her go while the cloth doll rested quietly in his large hand. The toy looked even smaller now that it was no longer being held by the child who loved it. Rico stepped closer and looked down at the doll. She really gave that up for $3. Jack slowly exhaled and stared at the store entrance where Naomi disappeared inside. Yes, she did. And something about that simple fact made it very clear to him that the story of this little girl was far from over. Jack Callahan stood still in the fading heat of the parking lot while the sliding glass doors of the grocery store closed behind Naomi Carter. For a few seconds, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the highway and the faint rattle of shopping carts being pushed across the concrete walkway. The cloth doll rested in Jack's large hand, its faded fabric moving slightly in the warm breeze. It looked even smaller now than it had when Naomi was holding it. Rico Morales stepped closer and looked down at the doll with disbelief written across his face. She really let that go for $3. Jack nodded slowly but did not speak right away. His eyes remained fixed on the grocery store entrance, as if he could still see the small girl walking through the aisles inside. Around them, the other riders from the Hells Angels group had begun to gather quietly. None of them were laughing or talking the way they normally did after a long ride. The mood had changed. Ben Carter crossed his arms and stared toward the doors. 7 years old and already trying to feed her family. That does not sit right with me. Another rider named Marcus Hill shook his head slowly. $3 for groceries. That is not even enough for a real meal. Jack finally looked down at the doll again. The small toy had been repaired more than once. The stitches on the arm were uneven, and the dress had been sewn back together at the seam. That meant Naomi's mother had probably fixed it when it started falling apart instead of buying a new one. Families who had enough money usually replaced things like that. Families who did not had to repair them over and over again. Jack turned the doll gently in his hand and noticed a small name written on the inside of the cloth tag. The name Daisy had been written in faded blue ink with careful letters that looked like they had been traced by a child learning to write. Rico leaned forward slightly. The kid even named it. Jack nodded. That means she loved it. And she still gave it up. The group fell silent again. Inside the store, Naomi was somewhere between the aisles trying to stretch $3 into enough food for 2 people. Jack knew exactly how little that amount of money could buy in a grocery store. A loaf of bread might take most of it. Eggs could cost more than that depending on the brand. Peanut butter would probably be out of reach entirely. Jack slowly closed his fingers around the doll and looked back at the men standing behind him. Every one of them had seen hard years before joining the club. Some had grown up poor. Some had served in the military and come home with scars that never fully healed. But none of them could ignore what they had just witnessed. A child had stood in a parking lot for hours trying to sell the only toy she loved so that her mother could eat dinner. Jack let out a slow breath through his nose and shifted his weight slightly. Rico studied his face. I know that look, Jack. Jack glanced over at him. What look? The one that means you are thinking about doing something. Marcus Hill gave a quiet chuckle under his breath. He is not thinking about it. He already decided. Jack did not argue with that. He lifted the doll slightly and looked toward the grocery store doors again. That little girl thinks $3 is going to solve her problem tonight. Ben Carter spoke quietly. But we all know it will not. Jack nodded once. No, it will not. The evening sun had started to sink lower behind the store, casting long golden shadows across the parking lot. A shopping cart rolled slowly across the pavement as someone returned it to the rack. Jack slipped the doll carefully into the inner pocket of his leather vest so it would not fall. Then he looked back at the group of bikers standing around him. 40 men who had ridden together across deserts, mountains, and highways for years. Men who understood loyalty and responsibility in a way most people never did. Jack's voice was calm but firm. Nobody here is riding out of this parking lot yet. Rico raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? Jack looked once more at the grocery store entrance where Naomi had disappeared a few minutes earlier. Then he answered in a quiet voice that carried enough weight to make every rider pay attention. I am thinking that $3 is not going to be the only help that girl gets today. Jack Callahan stood quietly for a moment after speaking those words. The parking lot had grown calmer as the evening moved closer to sunset, and the golden lights stretched across the pavement in long, warm lines. Several shoppers walked past the group of bikers with curious glances, but none of them stopped to ask questions. To most people, it simply looked like a group of riders taking a break after a long day on the road. Only the men standing there knew that something important had just shifted. Rico Morales leaned his shoulder against one of the motorcycles and watched Jack carefully. So what is the plan? Jack rested his hands on his hips and looked toward the grocery store doors again. Naomi had been inside for several minutes now. In his mind, he could picture exactly what she was doing. She was probably walking slowly through the aisles, comparing prices, and trying to stretch $3 into something that would last the night. A child should not have to make decisions like that. Jack finally spoke. First, we make sure she gets real groceries. Marcus Hill nodded immediately. That part sounds easy enough. Ben Carter glanced toward the entrance of the store. But if we all walk in there together, we are going to scare half the people inside. A few of the riders chuckled quietly at that comment because they knew it was probably true. 40 bikers in leather vests pushing carts through a grocery store would draw attention very quickly. Jack shook his head slightly. No, we do this the right way. He looked at Rico. You and Marcus go inside first. Find the girl and keep an eye on what she is buying. Do not interrupt her yet. Just watch. Rico pushed himself away from the motorcycle and adjusted his vest. Got it. Marcus nodded as well. They both began walking toward the sliding glass doors of the store at a calm pace, so they would not attract unnecessary attention. The rest of the riders stayed where they were in the parking lot. Jack watched the doors open and close behind Rico and Marcus before turning back to the group. The sun had dropped lower now, and the sky above the town was slowly changing to deep shades of orange and red. Jack reached into his vest pocket and carefully pulled out the small cloth doll again. He held it for a moment and brushed a bit of dust from its dress. The name Daisy was still faintly visible on the cloth tag. "That little girl trusted us enough to sell this to me," he said quietly. "That means something." Ben Carter nodded slowly. "She trusted you because you treated her with respect. Most people probably just walked past her sign like it did not exist." Jack placed the doll back into his vest pocket. "Then we make sure that trust was not misplaced." Several of the riders exchanged glances. They had known Jack long enough to understand what he meant. When their leader spoke like that, it meant the situation had already become personal to him. After a few minutes, the sliding glass doors opened again, and Rico Morales stepped back outside with Marcus Hill beside him. Rico walked directly toward Jack. His expression was serious. "You were right." Jack folded his arms. "Tell me." Rico took a slow breath before answering. "The kid is in the bread aisle right now holding a loaf and checking the price like she is doing complicated math. She picked up a carton of eggs, but put it back because it cost more than the bread." Marcus added quietly. "She stood there for almost 2 minutes staring at a jar of peanut butter before she finally put that back too. The $3 is not enough." Jack looked down at the pavement for a moment. He had expected that answer, but hearing it out loud still made his jaw tighten. Then he looked back at the group of riders standing around him. "All right. Now we move to the next step." Rico tilted his head slightly. "Which is?" Jack lifted his gaze toward the grocery store entrance one more time. The evening light reflected in the glass doors as they slid open and closed for other shoppers. The little girl inside that building thought she was solving her problem with $3 and a loaf of bread. Jack spoke in a calm voice that carried quiet certainty. "We are going inside. And tonight that girl is walking out of that store with far more than bread." Jack Callahan turned toward the grocery store entrance and began walking without hesitation. The rest of the riders followed behind him, their heavy boots striking the pavement in a slow, steady rhythm. The evening air carried the fading warmth of the desert sun as the glass doors slid open and the group stepped inside the store. The sudden change from hot outdoor air to the cool hum of fluorescent lights made the moment feel strangely quiet. Shoppers moved through the aisles pushing carts and reading labels, unaware that something unusual was unfolding. Jack signaled with a small motion of his hand, and the riders naturally spread out, instead of walking, as one large group. Years of riding together had taught them how to move without causing chaos. Rico Morales and Marcus Hill led Jack toward the bread aisle where they had last seen Naomi. As they turned the corner, Jack immediately spotted her. Naomi Carter stood in front of the shelf, holding a simple loaf of bread in both hands. Her small brow was furrowed as she studied the price tag beneath the row of loaves. Next to her feet was a small plastic basket instead of a shopping cart. Inside the basket, there was nothing yet. Naomi lifted the loaf and placed it gently inside the basket. Then she reached toward the eggs again, but paused halfway and slowly pulled her hand back. Her lips moved silently, as if she was counting in her head. Jack watched the scene from several steps away. Every movement the child made showed careful thought. She was trying to stretch $3 the way an adult might plan a weekly budget. The sight made Jack feel the same tight pressure in his chest again. Rico leaned close to him and spoke quietly. "She already checked the price twice." Jack nodded slowly. Naomi reached once more for the eggs, but after looking at the price, she placed them back on the shelf with a small sigh. Then she picked up the basket with the single loaf of bread inside and started walking slowly toward the front of the store. Jack stepped forward. "Naomi." The girl stopped and turned around. When she saw Jack and the other riders standing nearby, she looked surprised but not frightened. Her eyes moved briefly to the leather vests and then back to Jack. "Hello again, sir." Jack smiled gently so she would feel at ease. "Did you find what you needed?" Naomi lifted the basket slightly so he could see inside. "Bread." It was the cheapest one. Jack looked at the basket and then at her face. "What about the eggs?" Naomi shook her head. "They cost too much." Jack crouched down so they were at the same eye level again. "What about peanut butter?" Naomi gave a small shrug. "Maybe next time when we have more money." For a moment Jack did not answer. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder. Several of the riders were already standing quietly nearby, pretending to look at shelves, but clearly watching the conversation. Jack returned his attention to Naomi. "Would you like to show me the peanut butter aisle?" Naomi blinked in confusion. "But I cannot buy it." Jack smiled gently. "That is all right. Just show me where it is." Naomi hesitated for a moment, but then nodded and turned to lead the way. The basket with the single loaf of bread swung lightly in her hand as she walked. Jack followed beside her while several of the riders moved quietly behind them. When they reached the peanut butter shelf, Naomi pointed to the middle row. The jar she had been looking at earlier was still there. Jack picked it up and examined the label. Then he placed it carefully into Naomi's basket next to the bread. Naomi's eyes widened. "Sir, I cannot afford that." Jack looked at her calmly. "That is true, but I can." Naomi looked down at the basket where the bread and peanut butter now rested side by side. For a moment, she did not know what to say. Behind Jack, several of the bikers exchanged small smiles, because they knew something Naomi did not yet understand. This was only the beginning of what was about to happen. Naomi stood very still as she looked down at the basket in her hands. The loaf of bread rested beside the jar of peanut butter that Jack had just placed there. For several seconds she did not move because she was trying to understand what had just happened. She lifted her eyes slowly and looked up at Jack Callahan. "So you do not have to do that." Jack rested one hand gently against the shelf beside them and spoke in the same calm voice he had used since the moment he first approached her in the parking lot. "I know I do not have to. I want to." Naomi glanced down at the basket again. The peanut butter jar looked large next to the bread, and she could already imagine how many sandwiches it could make. Her voice was quiet when she spoke again. "My mom likes peanut butter sandwiches." Behind Jack, several of the bikers shifted slightly as they watched the exchange. Marcus Hill leaned toward Rico Morales and whispered softly, "That right there is why we came inside." Rico nodded without taking his eyes off the little girl. Naomi hesitated again before speaking. "But I still have to pay for the bread." Jack smiled slightly. "That is true, and we will take care of that too." Naomi blinked once in surprise. She had expected help with the peanut butter perhaps, but the idea that someone might also pay for the bread had not even crossed her mind. Jack gently pointed toward the basket. "Naomi, I think we should add a few more things before we go to the register." Naomi looked confused. "But I only came for bread." Jack nodded slowly. "That is because you were working with $3. He glanced toward the rest of the aisle where several of the riders were now standing quietly near different shelves. "But today you are not working alone anymore." Naomi did not fully understand what he meant yet, but something about the calm confidence in his voice made her listen. Jack stood up straight and gestured lightly down the aisle. "What else does your mom like to eat?" Naomi thought for a moment. "Sometimes we get soup." She pointed toward the end of the aisle where canned goods were stacked in tall rows. "And apples if they are on sale." Jack nodded once and looked over his shoulder. Ben Carter was already reaching for several cans of soup from the shelf. He placed them carefully into Naomi's basket one at a time. Marcus Hill walked over from the produce section carrying a small bag of apples and placed that beside the bread and peanut butter. Naomi's eyes widened again. The basket that had been empty only minutes ago was now slowly filling with food. She looked from one biker to another in quiet amazement. Jack crouched down beside her once more so that he was not towering over her. "Naomi, you said your mom has been very tired lately." Naomi nodded. "She sleeps a lot during the day now." Jack studied her face carefully. "Does she work somewhere?" Naomi shook her head. "She used to work at a restaurant, but she got sick and had to stop." Jack felt the pieces of the story slowly coming together in his mind. A mother too sick to work. A child trying to buy groceries with $3. A worn doll sold in a parking lot so that dinner could exist at all. Jack stood up again and looked at the riders nearby. "All right, gentlemen. Let us make sure this family has enough food for more than one night." The men nodded immediately. Within moments, several of them began moving through the nearby aisles gathering basic groceries. Bread, milk, cereal, pasta, vegetables, and more canned goods. Each item was placed gently into Naomi's basket until it quickly became too heavy for her small hands. Marcus quietly brought over a full-sized shopping cart and transferred the items into it. Naomi stared at the cart in disbelief as it slowly filled with food. Jack rested his hand lightly on the handle of the cart. "Naomi, this is what happens when people help each other." Naomi looked up at him with wide eyes. "But why are you helping us?" Jack glanced down at the basket where the loaf of bread and peanut butter still sat near the top. Then he answered in a steady voice. Because a 7-year-old girl should never have to sell her favorite doll just to feed her mother. Naomi Carter stood beside the shopping cart while the riders continued placing groceries inside it one by one. Only a short time earlier she had walked into the store holding $3 and hoping it would be enough for a single loaf of bread. Now the cart in front of her was slowly filling with food that would last far longer than one night. Boxes of cereal rested beside bags of rice. Cans of soup were stacked carefully near cartons of milk and fresh vegetables. Marcus Hill added another bag of apples to the cart, while Ben Carter placed 2 jars of pasta sauce next to a package of spaghetti. Naomi watched every movement with wide eyes, as if she was afraid the moment might suddenly disappear. She had never seen so much food gathered for her family at once. Jack Callahan rested his hands on the handle of the cart and looked down at her. Naomi, do you think your mother would like chicken for dinner? Naomi hesitated for a moment before answering. Yes, sir. She used to cook chicken with rice on Sundays before she got sick. Jack nodded once and looked toward the refrigerated section at the back of the store. Rico Morales was already heading that way with long, steady steps. A few minutes later, he returned carrying 2 packages of fresh chicken and placed them gently into the cart. Naomi watched as the cart became heavier and heavier. After a moment, she spoke again in a quiet voice. This is too much. Jack shook his head slowly. No, Naomi. This is what a family needs. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the cart again. The thought of bringing this much food home felt almost unreal. For weeks, she had watched her mother stretch small meals into something that lasted several days. Now there was enough here to fill the kitchen table. Jack noticed the thoughtful look on her face and crouched down beside her again. Naomi, where do you live? Naomi pointed toward the road outside the store. In the small trailer park behind the gas station. It is not far from here. Jack nodded slowly. Does your mother know? You came here today. Naomi shook her head. I told her I was going to the library after school. I did not want her to worry. Jack felt a quiet respect for the determination in that answer. A 7-year-old girl had walked to the grocery store alone and tried to solve a problem that many adults struggled with every day. Marcus Hill leaned against the cart and spoke gently. Naomi, when was the last time your mom saw a doctor? Naomi thought for a moment before answering. A long time ago. She said we cannot afford it right now. The words hung in the air between them. Jack exchanged a glance with Rico Morales and several of the other riders nearby. They had all heard the same thing in Naomi's voice. This family needed more than groceries. They needed help that went beyond one trip to the store. Naomi reached into her pocket and pulled out the $3 bills she had earned from selling the doll. She held them up toward Jack. I still have to pay you back for the peanut butter and the bread. Jack gently closed her fingers around the money and pushed her hand back toward her chest. Naomi, you earned that money today. You should keep it. Naomi looked confused. But you bought the doll. Jack reached into the pocket of his vest and carefully pulled out the small cloth doll again. Daisy rested in his large hand exactly as she had earlier in the parking lot. Naomi stared at it with surprise and a hint of sadness. Jack knelt down and held the doll out toward her. Naomi, I think Daisy belongs with you. The girl looked up quickly. But I sold her. Jack smiled gently. Sometimes a deal can be changed when the reason behind it changes too. Naomi slowly reached forward and took the doll back into her arms. She held it tightly against her chest for a moment. For the first time since Jack had met her, a small smile appeared on her face. Around them, the riders continued adding the final items to the cart, while other shoppers quietly watched the scene unfold. But what Naomi did not yet realize was that the groceries in this cart were only the first step in something much bigger that the 40 riders had already begun planning. Naomi Carter held the small cloth doll tightly against her chest while standing beside the grocery cart that was now full of food. For several seconds, she simply looked at everything inside the cart as if she still could not fully believe it was real. The bread and peanut butter rested near the top beside apples, soup, pasta, milk, and chicken. The smell of fresh groceries mixed with the cool air of the store while shoppers quietly moved through nearby aisles. Some of them slowed down when they saw the group of riders surrounding the small girl and the overflowing cart. Jack Callahan placed both hands on the cart handle and gave Naomi a calm smile. Well, Naomi, it looks like we are ready for the checkout line. Naomi nodded slowly, still holding Daisy carefully in one arm. She had slipped the $3 back into her pocket just as Jack told her to do. For the first time since she had walked into the store, her shoulders looked a little less tense. Jack began pushing the cart toward the front of the store while Naomi walked beside him. The other riders followed quietly behind them, spreading out so they did not block the aisles. As they reached the checkout area, a young cashier looked up from the register and froze for a moment when she saw the group approaching. Her eyes moved from the long line of riders to the large cart full of groceries, and then down to the small girl walking beside Jack. Jack greeted her with a polite nod. "Evening, ma'am." The cashier blinked once and smiled nervously. "Evening." She began scanning the items from the cart one by one. Each beep of the register echoed softly through the checkout lane as bread, apples, soup, rice, milk, cereal, pasta, vegetables, and chicken passed across the scanner. Naomi watched each item with growing amazement. She had never stood beside a cart filled with this much food before. When the last item was scanned, the cashier looked at the total on the screen. Her eyes widened slightly. "That will be $214. Naomi looked up quickly when she heard the number. Her small hand moved instinctively toward the pocket where the $3 rested, even though she knew it would not help. Jack calmly reached into his wallet and placed several bills on the counter without hesitation. The cashier counted them carefully before placing the receipt beside the bags. "Thank you, sir." Jack nodded politely and began lifting the grocery bags back into the cart while several of the riders helped organize them. Naomi stood quietly beside the cart, holding Daisy while she watched the process. When everything was packed, Jack looked down at her. "Naomi, are you ready to take these groceries home to your mom?" Naomi nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, she will be very happy." Jack smiled slightly. "Good. Because we are going with you." Naomi blinked in surprise. "All of you?" Rico Morales chuckled softly behind them. "Maybe not all of us inside the house, but we will make sure you and your mom get home safely." Naomi looked toward the store windows where the evening sky had turned deep orange outside. The thought of walking back to the trailer park with this much food felt almost unbelievable. Jack slowly pushed the cart toward the exit doors, and the riders followed behind them once again. As the doors opened and the warm evening air returned, Naomi stepped outside beside the cart and looked across the parking lot. The line of motorcycles was still waiting exactly where they had been parked earlier. The chrome reflected the fading sunlight, while the engines remained quiet. Jack stopped beside the motorcycles and looked down at Naomi again. "Which trailer is yours?" Naomi pointed down the road toward the gas station across the street. "The third row near the fence." Jack nodded and glanced back at the riders. "All right, gentlemen. Time for a short ride across town." Naomi looked up at the row of powerful motorcycles and then back at the cart full of food. What she did not yet realize was that when they reached her home, the evening was going to take another unexpected turn that none of them would soon forget. The warm evening air wrapped around the parking lot as the grocery cart rolled slowly across the pavement toward the row of motorcycles. Naomi Carter walked beside Jack Callahan, holding Daisy close to her chest while glancing again and again at the bags of food stacked inside the cart. The fading sunlight painted the sky above the town in deep shades of orange and gold, while the quiet hum of traffic passed along the nearby road. For Naomi, it felt like the longest and most important walk she had ever taken. Jack stopped beside the motorcycles and looked down at the cart. "All right, gentlemen, let us get these groceries loaded." Several riders stepped forward immediately. Marcus Hill lifted 2 heavy bags and placed them carefully into a saddlebag on one of the motorcycles, while Rico Morales secured another group of bags with strong straps across the back of a bike. Within a few minutes, the food was divided safely among several motorcycles so it would not fall during the short ride. Naomi watched the process carefully. She had never seen motorcycles used to carry groceries before, and the sight made her smile slightly. Jack crouched beside her again so he could speak at her level. "Naomi, do you feel comfortable riding with me for a few minutes?" Naomi nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I have never ridden a motorcycle, but I think it will be fun." Jack gave a small chuckle. "It will be a very short ride, and we will go slow." Rico Morales walked over holding a spare helmet and handed it to Naomi. "Here you go, kiddo. Safety first." Naomi placed the helmet on her head with Jack helping to adjust the strap so it fit properly. When everything was ready, Jack lifted her carefully onto the seat in front of him while the other riders started their engines one by one. The deep rumble of the motorcycles returned to the quiet evening air, echoing softly across the parking lot. Naomi felt the vibration beneath the seat and held Daisy tightly in one arm while gripping the handle in front of her with the other. Jack spoke calmly over the sound of the engine. "Just hold steady and enjoy the ride." Naomi nodded. The line of motorcycles slowly pulled out of the parking lot and turned onto the road leading toward the gas station Naomi had pointed out earlier. The ride lasted only a few minutes, but to Naomi it felt like something out of a movie. Cars slowed as the long line of riders passed by while the golden light of sunset reflected off the chrome of the motorcycles. When they reached the small trailer park behind the gas station, Jack slowed down and followed Naomi's directions through the narrow rows of homes. Finally, Naomi pointed ahead. "That one there with the blue steps." Jack gently stopped the motorcycle beside the trailer while the other riders parked along the edge of the small gravel road. One by one the engines shut off, and the sudden quiet returned. Naomi climbed down from the seat and removed the helmet while looking toward the front door of the trailer. A single light glowed through the small window beside the door. Jack removed his own helmet and nodded toward the groceries being unloaded from the bikes. "Let us bring the food inside." The riders carried the bags carefully up the blue steps and placed them near the door. Naomi reached forward and knocked softly. For a few seconds there was no answer. Then the door slowly opened. A tired woman with gentle eyes and pale skin stood in the doorway. Her hair was pulled back loosely and she looked surprised to see so many people standing outside her small home. Naomi smiled and ran forward. "Mom, look what happened." The woman blinked in confusion as she noticed the riders and the stack of grocery bags beside them. Jack stepped forward respectfully and spoke in a calm voice. "Good evening, ma'am. Your daughter had quite an adventure today, and we wanted to make sure you both had a proper dinner tonight." The woman looked from Jack to Naomi and then to the groceries, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected scene in front of her. But what she did not yet realize was that the help standing on her porch was only the beginning of a much larger change that was about to enter their lives. The tired woman standing in the doorway looked from the grocery bags to the line of motorcycles parked along the gravel road and then down at her daughter. Naomi still held the cloth doll Daisy tightly in one arm, while smiling with a mixture of excitement and relief. "Mom, they helped me at the store," Naomi said quickly. "They bought food for us." The woman blinked several times as if she was trying to understand how such a scene could possibly be real. Her name was Denise Carter, and the past few months had drained much of her strength. She had been struggling with illness, and the stress of losing her job at the restaurant had only made things worse. For days she had been trying to stretch what little food remained in the house, while telling Naomi that everything would be fine. Now she was standing in the doorway watching strangers carry groceries up her steps. Jack Callahan gave a respectful nod. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is Jack. Your daughter and I met outside the grocery store." Denise placed a gentle hand on Naomi's shoulder. "Naomi, what happened?" Naomi looked up at her mother and spoke quickly in her small voice. "I was selling Daisy so I could buy bread, but then Jack and his friends helped me." Denise looked down at the doll in Naomi's arms, and her eyes filled with emotion. She understood immediately what that meant. Naomi had been willing to give up the toy she loved most just to make sure her mother had something to eat. Denise covered her mouth for a moment as the realization settled in. Jack spoke again in a calm, steady tone. "Your daughter was trying to do something very brave today. We simply made sure she did not have to do it alone." Behind him, several riders carried the grocery bags through the door and placed them carefully on the kitchen counter. The small trailer kitchen slowly filled with food. Bread, milk, apples, soup, pasta, vegetables, chicken, and many other items were arranged across the counter until there was hardly an empty space left. Denise stepped inside and stared at the groceries in disbelief. "Naomi, this could feed us for weeks," she whispered. Naomi smiled and hugged Daisy again. Jack remained near the doorway, so he would not crowd the small room. Denise turned toward him again. "I do not know how to thank you." Jack shook his head gently. "You do not have to thank us." Denise hesitated before speaking again. Naomi said she sold her doll. Jack reached into his vest pocket and held up Daisy. "Actually, we made a small adjustment to that deal. Naomi gets to keep her friend." Naomi's smile grew even wider. Denise looked at the doll and then at the riders standing quietly around the small living room. The scene felt almost unreal. But Jack was not finished yet. He looked toward Rico Morales, who was standing near the kitchen counter. Rico nodded and stepped forward holding a small envelope. Jack turned back to Denise. "Naomi told us you have not been able to see a doctor for a while." Denise lowered her eyes slightly. "Medical bills are expensive. Jack gave a calm nod. We understand that. Rico handed the envelope to Denise. Inside was a card from a local clinic along with information for an appointment that had already been arranged. Jack spoke gently. Tomorrow morning a doctor will be expecting you. Denise looked at the envelope with trembling hands. I cannot accept something like this, she whispered. Jack shook his head again. Yes, you can. Because sometimes the right thing to do is simply helping someone get back on their feet. Naomi stood quietly beside her mother, holding Daisy while looking at the riders around the room. She still could not believe that the day had started with $3 and a cardboard sign in a parking lot. Now her home was filled with food, and her mother had help coming. The 40 riders began slowly stepping back toward the door so the small family could have space again. But what Naomi and Denise did not yet realize was that the kindness shown that evening would be remembered in their lives for many years to come. The small trailer grew quiet as the riders slowly stepped outside into the warm evening air. One by one the men moved down the blue wooden steps while the soft glow of the kitchen light behind them illuminated the stacks of groceries on the counter. Denise Carter stood in the doorway watching them with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Only a few hours earlier, she had been lying on the couch worried about how she would feed her daughter for the next day. Now the kitchen behind her was filled with food and a doctor appointment was waiting for her in the morning. Naomi Carter stood beside her holding Daisy tightly against her chest while watching the motorcycles parked along the gravel road. The powerful machines reflected the last golden light of the sunset as the sky slowly darkened above the trailer park. Jack Callahan stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned back toward the doorway. Naomi gave a small wave. Thank you, Jack, she said in her soft voice. Jack smiled and tipped his head slightly. You take good care of your mom now. Naomi nodded proudly. I will. Denise stepped forward as well. Her voice carried emotion that was difficult to hide. I will never forget what you did for us tonight. Jack shook his head gently. Just remember to take care of yourself and keep that doctor appointment tomorrow morning. Denise nodded firmly. I promise I will. The riders climbed back onto their motorcycles, and the quiet gravel road soon filled again with the deep rumble of engines starting one by one. Naomi stood on the porch beside her mother as the headlights flickered on and illuminated the narrow road leading out of the trailer park. When the first motorcycle slowly rolled forward, the others followed behind it in a long shining line. Naomi watched until the final red tail light disappeared beyond the gas station at the end of the road. The night grew quiet again. Inside the trailer, the kitchen counter was covered with food that would last many days. Denise turned toward her daughter and gently placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder. You were very brave today, Naomi. Naomi looked down at Daisy and smiled softly. I just wanted to help you, Mom. Denise pulled her daughter into a careful hug. And you did more than you know. The next morning, Denise kept the promise she made. She went to the clinic appointment arranged by the riders and spoke with a doctor who helped her begin treatment so she could slowly recover her strength. Over the following weeks, the groceries from that evening helped them through difficult days while Denise focused on getting better. Naomi returned to school, and Daisy remained safely in her arms every night when she went to bed. Word of what had happened spread quietly through the small town. People who had once walked past Naomi in the parking lot began to understand the story of the little girl who had tried to sell her favorite doll just to feed her mother. Months later, Denise was strong enough to return to work again, and the Carter home slowly returned to a normal rhythm. But Naomi never forgot the sound of those motorcycles arriving at the store or the moment when strangers chose to help her instead of walking past. Sometimes kindness appears when it is needed the most. On one difficult evening, a 7-year-old girl believed she had only $3 and a cardboard sign to solve her problem. Instead, she discovered that compassion can arrive in the most unexpected way, and that one small act of courage can change an entire life.